Eric, thanks so much for joining me one more time.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. While we start, I think it's best to just let everyone know today we'll be chatting about your upcoming book, AI and Consciousness. And you recently posted something online where you requested that anyone who emails you any comments on the entire manuscript will be thanked in print and receive an appreciatively signed hard copy. So,
That's right.
anything you want to say
It's
about
got
that?
to, I realized I need a clarification because a couple people read the manuscript and then sent me like a couple paragraphs of here are some general thoughts. And that might not be quite enough for a signed copy of the manuscript. I wouldn't call that comments on the entire manuscript. So be looking for a little more specific than that to get the copy. But anybody who says any comments at all will be thanked. Um, I really do appreciate those comments. I like getting comments from across the spectrum of people's knowledge because I want it to be accessible to people like your listeners who are intellectually interested and engaged, but not specialists. And I also want specialists to get value from it and people who are specialists in fields that are adjacent. So I value the comments from everybody.
And Eric, preferably from mid-December. I think that's the cutoff you want.
That's right. I will be doing a full revision starting in mid-December and then hopefully getting it to the press in early
Cool.
2026.
So that's a call to action. Everybody, please give some well thought out comments as much as possible. All right, Eric, let's begin. I think wonderful book, by the way. I think anyone who reads it, sorry, and listens to this podcast will get a really great understanding of this topic, AI and consciousness, clearly making the rounds every time you go online. This is the talk of the town. In your book, you start off immediately by framing this question. You start to frame what we call the fog. I think your opening line is all is fog. What exactly is this epistemic fog? And and why do you think we won't know if AI becomes conscious until we've built millions of disputably conscious systems?
Yes, right. Well, that's the whole book is basically my answer to that to that question. So, um, condensing it briefly, and I'm sure we'll get into more detail on this. Um, the science of consciousness is in its infancy. There are huge debates about the most basic things. The range of opinions is vast. The methodologies are highly contentious. And even for entities who are a lot like us, non-human animals, there's not a lot of consensus about whether they're conscious or how you measure it.
Mm.
So on the one hand, it's going to take a long time for the consciousness science to, I think, reach maturity, if ever it does. And at the same time, I think we are on the cusp. 5 to 30 years is my prediction of creating systems that a substantial group of really mainstream, respectable scientific theories say these things are conscious. They've got experiences. They're just as capable of suffering and pleasure as you and I are. And therefore, they deserve serious moral consideration. Maybe we could call them persons. They deserve rights or human-like rights. And at the same time, I think it's very plausible that there will be a substantial number of mainstream scientific and philosophical views that say, hey, look, these entities are just shadow play of empty mimicry. They have no more personhood or experience than a ceiling fan. And we won't know which theory is right. And people have opinions. Those opinions will be based in scientific theories of one sort or another, or based in their own personal inclinations and biases, or their culture or their religion or whatever. And those opinions will diverge. And as a group, we won't know what to do, whether we're facing real persons with real rights, serious rights like rights to reproduce, rights to a path to citizenship and the vote, the rights to employment for money, or whether these are just like our ordinary computers today and don't deserve anything like that kind of moral consideration, right? So I think we're on the cusp of that kind of, I want to call it a likely crisis.
I think the purpose for this episode for me, Eric, was to make sure people read the book because this episode will cover the book. However, we want them to still engage and interact. So the main goal here is we're going to take them on the journey through the book, and hopefully this inspires them to comment even further and allows you to clarify your thoughts even more. So that being said, is the fog primarily empirical, i.e., let's say neuroscience and AI opacity, or is it conceptual, like our grip on consciousness itself? So where do the two bleed together?
So let me say one thing I think it's not, which a lot of people might think it is, which is the last thing you said, which is that the problem is understanding the concept of consciousness itself. I do think that people mean different things by the word consciousness, and sometimes people talk past each other when they talk about consciousness. But I think there is a primary sense of consciousness that's used by consciousness scientists and by philosophers that we can pretty much all agree on and is pretty obvious, and that is really the target of this. And I don't think that these debates can be seen primarily as confusion about that concept. So to kind of help your listeners get a sense of this concept that I'm referring to, sometimes called phenomenal consciousness in the literature, but I think the word phenomenal is not necessary. It just helps disambiguate if someone's confused about exactly what the reference is. So I'll just use the word consciousness for this, right? So consciousness is an obvious property that several things that your listeners will be familiar with share, right? So if your listeners think about the sound of my voice as they're hearing it right now, their experience of that, if they think about their, say, a sudden rush of fear that they can recall from the recent past, maybe when they almost got in an accident or something like that, if they close their eyes and form an image, if they can, of, say, their mother's face, if they pause and think about, okay, what's the best way to get across town to grandma's house during rush hour? They think about if you stub your toe, there's an experience of pain, right? All of these things, the imagery, that kind of episode of thinking, inner speech, pain, sensory experiences like auditory experiences and visual experiences, they all have, I think, an obvious property in common that is kind of used by saying they're conscious or their experiences. And other mental episodes don't have that. So if you think about your knowledge that Obama was US president in 2010, which I assume you weren't thinking about 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes ago, that was an aspect of your mentality, your preparedness to answer that question in a certain way, but it wasn't any part of your experience. Right? If you think about the myelination of your axons, or if you think about skills that you have that are not being used at the time, there are lots of aspects of our mentality that aren't part of our stream of experience. So this term consciousness really refers to that thing, which I think is pretty obvious when you think about it, that we all share. So that's the target of philosophical and scientific inquiry in the primary sense. So I don't think disagreements are really primarily about the referent of that term. The question is that thing, that obvious thing that I have and you have and your listeners have, is that going to be present in an AI system? And to what degree? That's the fundamental question that is extremely difficult to answer scientifically.
So at some point you have to think, if neither introspection nor conceptual analysis can settle the essential features of consciousness, I mean, if these tools fail, what really can?
Right. So one of the things that I do in the book early on is I describe 10 possibly essential features of consciousness. And I won't go through all 10 for your listeners here, but they're things like subjectivity, right? The idea that consciousness always involves a kind of a sense of a self or a subject who is conscious. Another possibly necessary feature of consciousness is unity, the idea that if two conscious experiences are being had by the same subject, if there is a subject at a time, then they kind of are joined or unified in a certain way rather than being held entirely separately. Another really important one is access, right? The idea that a conscious experience is usable to, available for downstream cognitive processes. It's the kind of thing that you can remember, the kind of thing that you can report on, the kind of thing that can guide action. And I guess I'll mention one more important one, which is luminosity, the idea that when you have an experience, you're always in some sense aware of having that experience. You know that you have it, or at least you're in a position to know that you have it. So those would be 4 examples of these 10 features that philosophers and scientists have sometimes thought are present whenever consciousness is present. So these are what I call possibly essential features. So I think one of the first questions that a theorist of consciousness needs to figure out in order to make progress is, okay, which of these 10 features really is essential? Right? So if it's something like luminosity, the capacity to self-represent yourself as conscious or to have some kind of knowledge of your experience, then you're not going to have an AI system that's conscious unless it has some kind of self-representational capacity, some ability to think about, in some sense, what's going on in its own mind, whatever that is. So, right, that already suggests certain kinds of structural features that would be necessary for an AI system, right? But if you don't think luminosity is essential, then those features might not be essential, right? Or unity, or take unity as another case, right? If unity is essential, then disunified AI systems are going to be out. They're not going to be conscious entities, at least individual conscious entities. Whereas if unity is not necessary, then you might have, more disunified entities who are capable of consciousness, right? So there are going to be obvious structural and engineering constraints that follow from the essentiality of some of these properties. So I think that's both something close to a necessary starting point for thinking about these issues, and also already extremely difficult to resolve. So you had mentioned that I think that it's not possible to introspectively or conceptually resolve these questions about possible essentiality, right? So that's what philosophers will tend to do. They'll tend to say, when I introspect, I discover that conscious experience is always unified, or it always comes with a kind of representation of itself. And, well, number one, I don't think our introspections are actually all that reliable about these kinds of structural features. I mean, my 2011 book was really all about that. Complexities of Consciousness is the title of that book. But kind of even more fundamentally, there's what I call the problem of the narrow evidence base. We're really just one kind of entity. So it might be that in us, experiences are always unified. I'm not sure whether that's true. It might be that in us, when you have a conscious experience, there's always some kind of awareness of it as happening. But it doesn't follow that that's the case for all entities. One example I use in the book is I say it's like going to the Freemasons club and then polling everybody and discovering that everybody's a Mason, and then concluding that all people are Freemasons, right? Which is obviously, it's a biased sample, right? So you don't want to generalize just from what's universal among humans what would be universal among all conscious being. Right. So I think that's the problem with introspection. I can talk in a bit about problems with conceptual arguments, but I've been talking a long time and I want to just pause there.
No, I actually think that's a good idea. Let's, by all means, conceptual analysis. What's wrong with that?
Right. So the nice thing about conceptual analysis is that you don't have to worry about a biased sample, right? So an example of something that you can get through conceptual analysis is bachelors are not married, or quadrilateral rectangles have four sides, right? You don't need to kind of do a poll of bachelors to figure out, oh yeah, it looks like they're all unmarried, right? Or look at a bunch of rectangles and say, oh yeah, well, all rectangles have four sides. It's just built into the concept that bachelors are unmarried and the rectangles have four sides. So if you can establish that some of these possibly essential features are in fact essential on conceptual grounds, then you don't need to worry about the problem of the narrow evidence base. You don't need to worry about the fact that you've only looked at, humans and maybe some familiar animals so far. So the problem with that is that I don't think the conceptual arguments are very compelling, right? It is super compelling that bachelors are unmarried. It's like totally obvious. I think there are some obvious features like that, obvious conceptual features like that about consciousness. So, for example, that consciousness involves mentality in some broad sense of mentality, right? It's like it's a subtype of mental processes or mental states or something like that, right? That's, I think, pretty evident. Or that a conscious experience is an episode that transpires in time, right? Again, I mean, maybe you could challenge that, but again, that seems like that's built into the concept pretty obviously. But it is not in the same way obvious that consciousness must be unified, or that consciousness always comes with a grasp upon itself, or that consciousness involves some kind of self entity. All of these things, I think, are a reach. They're not obvious in the same way that the unmarriedness of bachelors is obvious. And we often think things are conceptually implied simply because we haven't thought clearly enough about possible counter instances and our conceptualizations are kind of narrow. One example I give of this in the book is the idea that rectangles have parallel sides. Right. So I think it's conceptually obvious that rectangles have four sides and they've got right angles. Right? It seems like that's built into the concept of rectangle. But that the sides are parallel, that's not a feature that applies in non-Euclidean geometry. Right. So if you have a rectangle in a non-Euclidean curved space, the sides actually aren't parallel. But you might not have thought of that if you're not familiar with the ideas of non-Euclidean geometry. So you might think that it's conceptually implied, but in fact it's not, because you've been thinking about too narrow a range of cases. So I think there's often that risk with conceptual claims. So I have not seen in my decades of doing philosophy of mind what I think are a really solid conceptual arguments that are not arguably limited or dicey in that way for any of these 10 features. Which isn't to say for sure that someone couldn't do the work, but I don't see it yet, and I'm not totally optimistic.
Yeah, the reason why I wanted you to continue with the conceptual analysis is because I think at this point it's always great for us to almost get at least a clearer definition of the two words used in the book title, consciousness and AI. Because regarding concepts, you want us that people hold too vague a concept of consciousness, which, I mean, you just discussed quite eloquently, but you also argue that people hold too rigid a concept of AI. So how must we reconceive both to even begin a conversation coherently about both these concepts.
Right. So yes, so we've already talked through kind of my attempt to clarify this idea of consciousness for people. Um, so regarding AI, right, one of the things I do also early in the book is try to loosen people's conception of what AI is. The way that I want to define AI is the kind of obvious way that something is an AI, an artificial intelligence, if it is both artificial and intelligent. Right, which seems kind of like obvious, but that's not usually how the term is defined. The term is usually defined in terms of computation or machines or something like that. And I think that's kind of limited, right? So one interesting example of this would be bioengineered systems. Um, Michael Levin has been making xenobots and anthrobots, which are, you know, kind of artificial biological entities that bot is a little, I'm not sure whether they should be called bots exactly, but there are these artificial entities that engage in behaviors, um, and it could be that the future of artificial intelligence is grounded much more in biology, biological systems, right? And there's also DNA-based computing, and there's neuromorphic computing. There's computing that's based on the idea of looking at electron spin. There's computing based on patterns of reflection of interference in light. So our kind of picture of computing as the kind of thing that transpires in silicon wafers, and is nicely describable through Turing, right? There can be analog computing, standard Turing machines are not analog machines, right? There can be analog computing. There are various proofs about the relationship between analog computing and Turing machines. We don't necessarily need to get into that here. But what I want to invite people to think of is AI, artificial systems, could look very different in the not very far future from what we currently think of. They don't necessarily need to be NVIDIA or Intel chips, right? So that, I think, hopefully loosens people's ideas a little bit about the future of computing. So even if there were a solid argument that, like, hey, computer chips of the sort we make today, they could never give rise to consciousness, it doesn't follow in general then that no AI system could be conscious.
Your borderline consciousness framework, um, it allows cases that are neither determinantly conscious nor unconscious. So could this apply to artificial systems? And if so, what does that mean for design and ethics?
Yes, right. I don't even get into this in the book. Well, maybe I probably mentioned it in passing somewhere, but um, yes. So I think we naturally tend to think of consciousness as something that is either present or absent, on or off. We think of it as a dichotomous property, but it doesn't seem very plausible that it would be a dichotomous property if you think about the science of it. If consciousness depends on something big and floppy and messy in the human case, like the brain, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would like always switch on in an instant and then switch off in an instant. It seems much more plausible. So I get into this in some detail in a 2023 paper called Borderline Consciousness, but it seems much more plausible that in development, in evolution, in transitions between non-conscious and conscious states, there will at least be some times where the right thing to say is it's not quite right to say this thing is conscious, not quite right to say it's non-conscious, right? So you could think about canonical, vague, boundaried properties like being green or being an extrovert or being bald, right? There's not like a sharp point at which something goes from non-green in an instant to green. Uh, or non-bald, here's the one hair. Um, so so consciousness, I think it's pretty plausible that consciousness is like that. There will be in-between cases. So it's definitely a possibility that we will have AI systems that are in this in-between state where it's not quite right either to say that they're conscious or that they're non-conscious.
Hmm. And I think that becomes important because then as we start to traverse the theoretical landscape, which we're about to do now, that becomes very fundamental because different theories of consciousness tend to play around that concept quite a bit. So let's take some of the big players in the game. So global workspace, IIT, higher order theory, whatever it may be. Which of these, if any, best scales to non-biological architectures?
Um, so let's take global workspace theory, which in its various incarnations is, I think, probably the most commonly accepted general theory in consciousness science, which isn't to say it's a majority view, because there are a lot of views out there. Um, so on global workspace theory, basically you have various input streams or modules that a conscious system is responding to its environment through various inputs. And then there are various ways that a system can behave or types of output, like it might be able to move, it might be able to speak. And then you also have things like short-term and long-term memory. So all of these you could kind of conceive of as being somewhat separate, but in global workspace theory, there's a shared bulletin board, so to speak, or workspace, where some processes or representations become widely accessible throughout the system, right? So in the human case, if you open your eyes and you look at, say this tea mug and you think about it for a second, right? The whiteness of the tea mug or the tea mugginess of it is something that is occupying your global workspace. It's something you're conscious of. You're having an experience of that visual experience of that tea mug, and it can influence various downstream processes. Like you can now say, "Ah, yeah, I'm seeing a tea mug," and you can now remember. 5 minutes later, it'll be like, "Oh, well, Schwitzgebel held up this tea mug," right? And if we were here together in this room, you could reach for it, right? So there are various ways in which the process or representation or experience of that mug is available for the downstream processes. And what it is for something to be conscious is just for it to occupy that global workspace. Now, there's lots of stuff going on that's not going to go into the global workspace. So you weren't thinking probably about the feeling of your feet in your shoes. What I was talking about, that tea mug, right? That was not something that was going to be widely influencing downstream processes. It wasn't something that is likely to be remembered. So you would have this kind of selection process or attention process or some kind of winnowing of all the stuff that's going on with you cognitively. And then some relatively small selected group is broadcast into this workspace. So that's the global workspace theory. So you can see how you could create a computer architecture like this. It seems relatively straightforward. And as one of maybe the leading voice in global workspace theory, Stanislaw Dehaene, argued back in 2017, ancient days, so to speak, it wouldn't be that hard to create an architecture that had a global workspace and thus would be conscious according to this theory. Dehaene and his collaborators in that paper suggest that you could take an autonomous vehicle, a self-driving car, and if you joined its systems together, right? Cars have many separate computers in them, right? But if you join their systems together well enough and created a workspace where these cars were accessing, the various subsystems were able to access a common workspace to guide their processes, then you'd have a conscious self-driving vehicle. So it seems pretty straightforward to create conscious architectures in a global workspace theory. At least minimally conscious architectures. And maybe there's, global workspace theorists might want to think about this and say, hey, wait, Lex, actually, I want to add a few more qualifications, and it's got to be, you might want to add more to this. I call this actually the problem of minimal instantiation, right? So it seems like you could create a system that has two tiny little input streams, two tiny little output streams, one tiny little memory store, and some workspace in between them. You could have done this in the 1960s, right? And then it would be conscious, maybe, according to that theory. So I call that the problem of minimal instantiation, right? So you can either say, yeah, it will be conscious, maybe in a limited minimal sense, right? Or you can say, hey, wait. No, it needs to be big enough or sophisticated enough in a certain way, and you can kind of add details to your workspace theory. So yeah, that's a global workspace theory.
So I'm thinking about the time I think you, Susan Schneider, Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and there was one more author in that paper. I can't remember who it was, but you're working with these people who've written so much about consciousness. Robert comes out with this massive landscape of consciousness, and now there's so many more theories to work with. I mean, I mentioned a few just now. We've got IIT, higher order theory. There's so many recurrent associative ones. And then Robert has all the idealisms, the panpsychisms, and he's got all the possible, I think there's over 350 at this point.
Yeah.
How do you
you haven't even checked my email yet. I would say about once a week I get a new theory of consciousness in the email from somebody.
Yeah. I just spoke to Robert today, and it's over 350 at this point, and it's constantly growing. When you look at the 10 possible essential features that you need for these theories of consciousness, do any of them suffice?
Well, I mean, take something like panpsychism. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is everywhere. Maybe you could say everything is conscious, or at least everything participates in consciousness, or everything has conscious parts, something like that, right? Even fundamental particles are conscious on certain standard types of panpsychism. So it doesn't seem like on that view any of these essential properties would be essential, right? Because if you're talking about the consciousness of a quark, probably not going to have self-representations or any kind of sense of itself as a self, or capacity for downstream access, unity. It doesn't seem like those things are going to be very plausible on panpsychist views, although, I mean, maybe you could work your way into that. So yes, once you widen the realm of views that you're considering, unless you think these views are conceptually incoherent, it's going to be very hard to hold that any of these 10 possibly essential features are in fact essential. Right now, you could say they're incoherent, right? That's what you have to say. If you think that, say, unity is truly essential to consciousness, and some theory posits conscious entities that lack unity, then you have to say, well, they're basically doing things like saying, here's a three-sided rectangle, right? They have to be incoherent. So, yeah, the book is premised on mainstream materialism. I have a chapter where I talk about how these same issues will arise, and there's a possibility of AI consciousness on relatively generic versions of most alternatives to mainstream scientific materialism.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think once you open the Pandora's box, so to speak, of idealism and panpsychism and substance dualism and all that kind of stuff, that makes the issues even vastly more complicated.
Yeah, I
And
think
I don't write those views off. I mean, my previous book, The Weirdness of the World, takes those views seriously. But in order to kind of get any kind of scope reduction and make this at all manageable, the present book on AI and consciousness kind of assumes mainstream scientific materialism.
Yeah, I think let's get back to that, because I mean I was just curious, because that'll just take us a whole nother podcast. But what, when it comes to the materialist theories that we spoke about, so if you take the ones we briefly discussed, you challenge the conceptual necessity in theories like global workspace theory as well, that consciousness must require the global access. Is any
Right.
structural or functional property even plausibly necessary across all possible conscious systems?
Yes. Right. So I had mentioned that one of the possibly essential features was access, right? And global workspace theories are theories that build that in,
Mm.
right? So, so they take as part of their grounding supposition of the theory that it is essential to consciousness that conscious experiences be broadly accessible to downstream processes. That's just built into the theory. So if that theory is right, that is an essential feature of consciousness. Now, I want to be careful about what I said earlier and not to overinterpret it, right? So I had argued that I'm not convinced that there currently are successful conceptual arguments for any of these features, these possibly essential features, as being actually essential. But that doesn't mean that some of them, I mean, some of them might still be actually essential. It's just that I don't think we could know that through sitting in our armchairs and thinking about our concepts, right? If it's ever going to be established, then it's probably going to require a lot of science.
I think it reminds me.
So, yeah,
Sorry, Eric. It reminds me of Dan Dennett and illusionism, because it's almost intuition pumps for looking at comparing rival theories of consciousness, because it's a great way to actually just systematically expose another theory of consciousness in a sense. You could see it as using those 10 essential features, for example. If you take multiple, and we're only talking about materialist theories of consciousness now, but it's a great way to sort of show, I mean, these are some essential features we believe are essential, and this is where you're falling short. Is that how you see it?
um,
Not to prove that consciousness is an illusion, but
right,
almost as intuition pumps for theories of consciousness.
kind of. What I want, part of what I want the reader to get out of these 10 possibly essential features is a certain amount of confusion. So that's this. I want intuitions to be primed enough for you to see, yeah, I could see how that might be an essential feature of consciousness. And like Dennett, I want to, I think there's good grounds to mistrust our armchair intuitions about this sort of thing. So I don't want I hope the readers don't go so far. And that's part of the reason for barraging people with 10. Right? If it was just two or three, people might say, oh, yeah, that all sounds essential. Let's go. Right. But with 10, it's like, whoa, this is a kind of a bit, really? Right. So they kind of, I hope, serve to kind of counterbalance each other and warm you up to thinking, okay, some of these 10 might be essential, probably not all. How do I know which? So I want to induce that kind of open-minded confusion. And then the thought is maybe, well, I'm not necessarily convinced of this, but I don't rule it out. Maybe after a long time with enough good science, although I personally don't see how, we could say, yeah, we've discovered access and unity are essential. These others are not essential, right? Science can discover really amazing things given enough time, right? Who would have thought that we could figure out what was going on in the first millisecond of the Big Bang, given that it happened so long ago and our evidence base is so limited, basically, light coming in. But science can do some really pretty amazing things given enough time. But I think it's distant enough and difficult enough that I don't think any of us can really foresee how to generalize our current science to answer these questions via some universal theory that would apply to all animals on Earth, all AI systems, all possible alien systems. That's what we really need is a universal theory.
Just to touch back on the the metaphysics of mind, we just spoke about the fact that you engage with theories like dualism, panpsychism, idealism without active dismissal, especially if you look at your previous work. Um, but is in this book you're focused on a materialism framework, and you say that materialism is broadly friendly. I think it was to
Yeah.
AI consciousness. is Was this merely to make it easier to write a book like this, or do you firmly almost believe that the other theories of consciousness are not the ones you would take seriously fundamentally, and even if maybe you won't dismiss them?
Um, yeah, I would say that my own personal credences are about 50% mainstream scientific materialism and about 50% everything else. And even among the everything else, some of the alternatives, like say Chalmers's property dualism, are really pretty close in these kinds of issues regarding AI consciousness to mainstream materialism in their implications. Um, my credence in say substance dualism, where there's an immaterial soul that is, ontologically distinct from uh, the body, is I don't dismiss it, but it's a relatively small slice of my credence pie, so to speak. So I am more comfortable myself, just kind of
Yeah.
working within the mainstream scientific materialist worldview, and it takes me a certain amount of sympathetic energy to lean into idealism and panpsychism and substance dualism and transcendental idealism. And I can lean into those things and feel the attractions of them. Um, but that's not my bet.
I mean, one of the, if we were to stick on that metaphysical theme without going into the other theories at this point, but one of the metaphysical views, how would you read the metaphysical weight of it from bit? So the idea that information itself could be the fundamental substrate.
Yeah, so it from bit is an interesting possibility that has not been as much metaphysically explored as probably it deserves to be. It's the idea that what's fundamental is information. So immediately one wants to think, okay, what is information? If we're going to get that view straight, then we better get straight what information is. Now, if you think information is just, say, causation, then that view becomes, what's fundamental is causation. And maybe causation itself is just can be understood in terms of certain patterns of regularity, right? That's one theory of causation. There are other theories, right? So then you have a view on which what's fundamental are just that there are certain patterns of regularity in the universe. And I don't know, that's not so bad a view. And maybe it's not so different from certain ways, even of thinking about materialism. What is it for something to be, say, an electron or a quark? Maybe it is just to be prone to enter certain causal relations. Does there have to be some juice inside on top of that? Uh, so those kinds of metaphysical issues, I think, are pretty complicated and worth exploring.
Mm.
But within that general framework, broadly friendly, as I would say, still to AI consciousness, right? It from bit, I mean, the very idea of calling it a bit suggests computation at the core, right? So it would be unsurprising if some computational entities of the sort that we could artificially design were also conscious.
At some point, we're going to have to all agree. So it all comes down to, at some point, is it mimicry or is it actually happening? So your mimicry argument blocks inference from behavioral resemblance to consciousness. Uh, so given mimicry's unpredictability, what indicator properties, example, trace conditioning or valence, whatever, could serve as pragmatic proxies, short of a consciousness detector, let's say.
Right. So the mimicry argument, and I developed this in collaboration with Jeremy Pober, is the idea that if something has been designed as a mimic, and we have a pretty complicated theory of what counts as mimicry. I don't know if we need to get into all the details of that here, but the kind of simplified version is if something has been designed as a mimic of superficial feature, then you can't, that defeats the inference from the superficial features to the underlying features that would normally be indicated by those superficial features, right? So the standard example we turn to is the viceroy butterfly, right? So monarch butterflies are toxic to predators. Viceroy butterflies have wing patterns that are very similar to monarch butterflies, but they're not as toxic to most predators as monarchs are. So if you see the wing pattern of the monarch, you can infer toxicity, right? But the wing pattern in the in the mimic, that is the viceroy, you can't infer toxicity. Now, it could be toxic to some predators, but you can't infer it in the same way you can for the model organism, that is the monarch butterfly. So similarly, right, if a person speaks, says, hello, good morning, you can normally infer, that's a conscious entity who's greeting me, right? But if something has been designed to mimic the superficial, hello, good morning, this could be good old-fashioned AI, of course, right? Or it could be a large language model. Can't infer in the same way from that superficial property to the underlying consciousness because there's a different explanation for why that superficial property is there, right? An explanation that involves being designed to match a model, right? So it could be that the entity is conscious, but you can't infer it in the same way you can for the human, right? So that's the mimicry argument against the inference to consciousness in AI systems that might superficially seem to be conscious. So, right. So, all right. Where were we? Sorry, that was only half of your question, and I've forgotten what
It
the other
was a
half
pretty
was.
long question. I'm sorry. I asked, given the undecidability, what indicator properties could we use to serve as a um, almost a consciousness detector? For example, trace conditioning, valence, or any sort of properties that you could think of that would help us spot the mimics.
Yeah.
This is something
So,
when I had a colloquium episode with Carl Friston and Mark Solms, and the topic of discussion was, is it possible to engineer artificial consciousness? And mimicry became such a big part of that conversation. So I think it's important to touch on this, since your book is fundamentally about that.
yeah, right. I mean, yes. So, Pober and I also have a paper, just a separate standalone paper, currently under revise and resubmit on the mimicry argument. Um, So it's a feature of the book, but also we're developing it independently. I think it's really important that a lot of the skeptical arguments against consciousness implicitly rely on some version of the mimicry argument, but it's never really been formalized or put in terms of, okay, let's think carefully about what exactly mimicry is. So yeah, so that's a contribution in one chapter of the book, but also in more detail in a paper with Pober. So indicator properties, right? So I was one of the many, I think 19 authors on this paper that came out in 2023 on indicator properties for consciousness and AI systems. I was probably among the most skeptical, if maybe not the most skeptical member of that team. Um, so the idea of that project, and I do refer to it favorably near the end of one of the chapters in the book, is that if you assume a certain kind of computational functionalism about consciousness, right? This would then be basically a subset of materialist views. But there are also some non-materialist views that would be computational functionalist in a sense. If you assume computational functionalism, that is, if you kind of capture computationally a certain set of functions, then that would be sufficient to generate consciousness. If you assume that, and then you look at the leading theories of consciousness, then you can find properties that are suggested by those theories. And if a system has a whole bunch of those properties, then it's reasonable to think it's more likely to be conscious than a system that mostly lacks those properties. So this is a way of getting not at all a clear answer or a consciousometer, right? But at least a little bit of a foothold on something like probabilities. So for example, on a lot of theories, you need something like recurrence in order for consciousness to occur, right? So in global workspace theory, you would typically think of the thing that's in the workspace as then feeding back into the workspace over at least a short period of time and endures there. That's a kind of recurrent function, or it can go into memory and then come back out of memory. Right? So there's a kind of recurrent functionality in there. There's an important class of theories called recurrence theories, where recurrence is, in fact, kind of the essential thing. There's occurrence is a very powerful kind of computational function that seems necessary, probably practically speaking, for an entity that's going to have sophisticated capacities for self-representation and self-monitoring. So a lot of theories, but not all theories. Integrated information theory has recurrence elements. A lot of theories are going to have either imply recurrence or built upon explicitly upon recurrence ideas. So if you had a simple feed forward structure with no recurrence, then it's reasonable to think that's less likely to be conscious than a system that does have recurrent feed. Now, it could be that the right theory is not imply recurrence. I mean, panpsychism doesn't imply recurrence, right? And there will be some ways of developing materialist theories where you don't necessarily have to have recurrence. But if you're going to look in the first place for a system that's going to be conscious, you might look for systems that have recurrence. Another kind of feature that seems common to a lot of ways of thinking about consciousness is something like flexible responding to the environment, right? So you see this in associative learning views like that of Ginsburg. You see it in embodied and inactive views, flexible responding to the environment. It seems like it's global workspace views seem like, oh yeah, if it's in the global workspace and it's available for use by lots of these processes, that seems like that's kind of maybe going to encourage and maybe be necessary for flexible responsiveness to the environment. So that's another kind of thing that you could look for in conscious systems, right? Something that just operates by reflex and doesn't respond flexibly in any way seems like a less likely candidate according to a range of mainstream views than something that is flexibly responsive and learns and improves its responses over time. So those would be the kinds of broad theoretical indicators that I would think are the basis for first guesses about where consciousness is more likely versus less likely.
The reason why I brought up the Mimicry argument is there's also the Copernican argument, and which rejects biological chauvinism. How far can this principle stretch before it tips into panpsychism or unchecked anthropomorphism?
Right. So this is also in that paper with Jeremy Poe, where we talk about the mimicry argument and the Copernican argument. So the Copernican argument goes like this. So you might have thought, Ned Block sometimes says stuff like this, that it could be the case that in order to be conscious, you need to have the very specific biology of a human. You've got to get all of those low-level biological details right. You got to have carbon-based neurons with axons and dendrites and sodium channels and all that junk. Let's not call it junk. All that wonderful stuff. The Copernican argument is a challenge to that. So the idea is it's plausible. Majority of astrobiologists who specialize in this type of thing think it's plausible that in our vast universe, on the order of 1 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, and the universe is probably bigger than just the part that we can observe. In our vast universe, there's probably at least 1,000 different places where entities as sophisticated as us behaviorally have evolved, right? That would only require occurring once per every billion galaxies that entities who are behaviorally sophisticated as we are will have evolved. And by behavioral sophistication, we're going to have a pretty high bar here for this argument. We're going to say you've got to be capable of long-term planning, kind of like humans do. Got to be capable of complex social coordination, like humans do, and complex communication, kind of like our language, very flexible language, right? So humans, if the humans' sophistication in those respects is the standard, it looks like on Earth, probably only humans are behaviorally sophisticated to that high bar, right? Now, probably there are at least 1,000 other entities like this elsewhere in the universe. Probably also, they're going to be a little different from us. They're going to have evolved in somewhat different environments. There's no guarantee that their genetics is going to be based on DNA. Even if it's based on DNA, there's no guarantee that they're going to have a brain with neurons like ours, with axons and dendrites and exactly the same kinds of neuropeptides and all that kind of stuff. I mean, even mollusks have slightly different sets of neuropeptides. And if you look at garden snails, actually the differentiation between dendrite and axon is not as clear as in human cases and vertebrate cases. So, even on Earth, we're already getting some difference in low-level behavioral and low-level physiology of the brain. So it would be really surprising, I think, not impossible, if like all of these 1,000 species had brains just like ours. All right, so that's the kind of biological plausibility setup. And then here's the Copernican idea. We would be uniquely special in a weird way if among all of these entities, only we were conscious and the rest were kind of mere, so to speak, zombies that were all dark inside and had no experientiality at all. That would be strange. It would be like being at the exact center of the universe. I mean, we could be at the exact center of the universe, but you need a pretty good argument to establish that. The initial thing is, okay, let's just assume we're in a mediocre place, right? So likewise, I think, we should assume with respect to this plausibly diverse range of behaviorally sophisticated entities that we would not be so special as to be the only one blessed with consciousness, or only one out of 100 are blessed with consciousness. I think it's plausible, both scientifically and mathematically, and in terms of our intuitions, to think, okay, I mean, almost all science fiction just assumes this, right? Okay, if they're behaviorally sophisticated, even if they're kind of pretty different on the inside, they're probably conscious. Unless they're mimics, PS. Right? So that then, if that's right, that thinking would establish, at least as a default starting place supposition, that being conscious does not depend on having exactly our kinds of brains. So that then kind of opens the door a bit to thinking about AI systems, right? So that undercuts the argument to say, hey, look, we really don't know. Consciousness might depend specifically on the details of our brain. it undercuts that argument, and it opens, I think, us up to a more kind of Pober and I call this default liberalism, right? If an entity is behaviorally sophisticated, we should kind of default to this liberal assumption that it's probably conscious.
Yeah, exactly.
And then AI systems might be like that. And if they're mimics, that undercuts the inference from the superficial behavioral sophistication to the underlying thing. But if they're not mimics, then default liberalism is a natural starting place. That's the thought.
Yeah, the mimicry and Copernican arguments, they almost balance and tension each other out. It's dialectically, it's 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 something that's going to work to show us as well that AI can be a stress test for anthropocentrism in consciousness science. This is a great way to show that our biases play a huge role, and we're very blind in many ways when it comes to judging non-human minds, both biological or synthetic, and even strange intelligences. These are all open doors for us, and you seem to highlight that pretty well in your book and work in general.
Yeah, that's the idea, right? And the reason that Pober and I put the Copernican argument and the mimicry argument in the same paper, even though it makes this paper giant and complex, right, is that they are kind of counterpoints to each other.
Yeah.
And I think they illuminate each other in a certain way because the mimicry argument is a kind of an argument against AI consciousness. The Copernican argument is a kind of argument for AI consciousness. Neither of them is super direct. Neither of them is based in, here's the right theory, scientific theory of consciousness. They're both based on very broad epistemic principles. And what you get is a kind of pessimism about AI consciousness in the near term based on these mimics, especially large language models, which I think have a mimicry structure, but a kind of that's balanced by a long-term liberality about the possibility of consciousness. So we get kind of, I think, a sensibly moderate position that says, okay, look, in the future, especially if you have this broad vision of what AI could be, as we talked about earlier, right? There's no reason to be so fussy about it's got to be made like us. But there is this caution for the short term that's really important. You mentioned strange intelligence. I could get into that if you'd like.
Yeah, I think so. So that was me setting that all up anyway. So
So this concept I owe to my current dissertation student, Kendra Chilson. And the guiding thought of her dissertation is that we have this picture that people kind of fall into, that there's a linear scale of intelligence from subhuman / narrow, as it's sometimes called, AI, to human level artificial general intelligence, to superintelligence, right? And it's this linear scale, and we should expect kind of progress along that, right? And Chilson's idea is that what we should be more likely to expect, and I think most people agree with this on reflection, it's just not been thematized and conceptualized and thought through very well, right? But what we should expect is instead that AIs, because they're structurally built very differently from us, would have strange intelligence. It would be superhuman in some capacities, way less than human in others, would have surprising mix of capacities and incapacities. Right? If you think about our intelligence, we have a surprising mix. What might seem like from an alien perspective would be a surprising mix of capacities and incapacities. We're really great at some amazingly complex tasks, like ask someone to walk through a boulder field, right? We cannot get AI systems to do that very well yet, right? That's a really complex bipedally, right? A really complex matter of integrating visual input and tactile input and balance, and it's complicated, right? But give us a simple logic problem, like you could solve with 2 bits of information, and our heads get blown, right? If anybody knows the Ways and selection task, that's my favorite example of this. Maybe I won't exhaust your viewers by giving it, but people could look it up. The Ways and selection task, WASON. It's really logically simple, but 90% of people get it wrong.
I feel
We're
like
really bad
I
at
feel like
formal logic.
You're going to let them down if you don't. If you don't get, feel free.
Oh, so you do want to hear the ways in
Yeah,
selection task?
I think
Yeah,
so.
let's do it. Okay, okay,
Good.
okay. So, um, so on the table in front of you are 4 cards. You know about these cards that each of them has a letter on one side and a number on the other. 2 of the cards are letter side up and 2 of the cards are number side up. The letter side up cards say A and C, and you don't know what the numbers are. And the number side cards say 3 and 7, but you don't know what the letters are. Now, the question is, which card or cards do you need to turn over to figure out whether the following rule is correct? If a card has a C on one side, it has a 7 on the other side.
So we've got A and C, 3 and 7.
Correct.
If a card has an A on one side, it has a 3 on
A 7.
7 on the other
I
side.
think I said 7, yeah.
Ace and
Which card or cards do you need to turn over? What's the minimum number of cards that you need to turn over? Which ones?
Oh, I have no idea. I'm not even going to try.
Yeah, right. 90% of people get this wrong. I'm not sure about the exact number, but it's in the ballpark, and it depends, of course. Even people who are pretty good at formal logic and are
Yeah.
educated will often get this wrong. So most people will say you need to turn over the C. Make sure that there is a 7 on the other side. Right. But the thing most people get wrong is that you have to turn over the 3, but you don't have to turn over the 7. You have to turn over the 3 just to make sure there isn't a C on the other side. But with the 7, it kind of doesn't matter what's on the other side, whether it's a C or an A or a D or an F or whatever. Right. So this is actually logically very simple. But most people get it wrong. It's so much more simple than walking across a boulder field.
It's in hindsight, it's very simple, but
People find it much easier if you do it in terms of social norms, right? So this is structurally the same thing, right? The cards have ages on one side and drinks on another. And the rule is if the person is under 18, they aren't drinking alcohol, right? So if you have 17 and 35 and gin and Pepsi, everyone knows you check the 17-year-old and you check the gin drinker, right? You don't need to check the Pepsi and you don't need to check the 35-year-old, right? That's exactly structurally the same, but it's really obvious in the case of a social norm, but it's not obvious when it's abstract logic, right? So, right. So that's the ways in selection task. Humans are really bad at that. We wouldn't want an alien kicking us out of the intelligence club because it's shocked at how horrible we are at formal logical reasoning, right?
yeah.
Right. There,
It reminds me, the strange intelligent concept reminds me a lot of Murray Shanahan. He talks about conscious exotica within the space of possible minds. And that's something we spoke about when he discussed in the movie, what is the film called? Ex Machina.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very similar concept.
Yeah, right. So the idea is you're going to have this mix. It's going to probably not be much like the human mix
Yeah.
of incredibly great capacities at some things and remarkable incapacities at others, right? Things are limited. There are always engineering and cost trade-offs between capacities, and it's not going to be the same set of trade-offs and the same set of limitations in the human case and the non case. You're going to have strange intelligence. That's
And,
the idea.
and it's very much
And
similar
then that's going to challenge us, right? Because we're used to evaluating consciousness in intelligences like ours,
exactly.
but how exactly this is going to transfer to stranger cases,
So it's
very
like watching
unclear.
watching the movie Her.
Oh, yeah. Right. So that's a strange intelligence.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about that, Eric, before I ask the next question?
Let me just mention a couple of dimensions of strange intelligence
Yeah.
just to give your listeners just a little bit more of a flavor of how weird things could be. Right. So we normally have unified we think, streams of experience that endure over fairly long periods of time. It could be the case that AI systems have much shorter flashes of experience that aren't really unified over long periods of time. That would be really pretty different from us, but it seems like a possibility. Another possibility is that AI systems could be very disunified compared to us, right? If it turns out that unity is not an essential feature, right? It could be that they present different faces to different people, and there's not a kind of unified center of action. It could be that they draw on vastly different resources, right? These mixture of experts models that are now being used in large language models. So it's like, it will, as you're having a conversation, will pull on a domain of expertise over here, and then on a different domain of expertise over here. It might not be like an integrated center, right? So you could end up with highly disintegrated, non-unified consciousness, right? So those are just some initial thoughts about ways in which it might not just be the capacities that are radically different from what we assume, but the very structure of consciousness itself could be radically different from what's familiar to us.
Eric, something that just came to my mind when you said that is just to play devil's advocate a little bit. What are your thoughts then on, let's say, a psychiatric patient who has the opposite of everything you just mentioned? So the disunity occurs, temporal flow's gone, everything starts to just completely out of whack. Are they less conscious?
Well, not necessarily.
Uh-huh.
Right. So I'm not committed to consciousness being unified. I'm not committed to it being temporally extended. I'm just saying that in the ordinary course of ordinary flow of things for ordinary people, that's how we think about it. And that's how our intuitions and first reactions tend to be based on those kinds of familiar cases. Yeah, and it's possible that you already see the limits of this with atypical people. Yeah.
Eric, when it comes to the leapfrog hypothesis, so the leapfrog hypothesis predicts we'll decide AI consciousness via social consensus, not evidence. Are you pessimistic about this capacity for epistemic humility here?
Yeah. All right. So let's pull apart what I call the leapfrog hypothesis and the social semi-solution. So now we're in I think this is the concluding chapter of the book. So the leapfrog hypothesis is this. It's that you might have thought, the first AIs that we create that are conscious are going to be kind of animal-like with simple, minimal consciousness. And, that's kind of okay. We're used to not being certain about what animals are conscious. Are ants conscious? There's a lot of debate about that kind of thing. And if they are conscious, they're certainly not going to get human-like rights. You wouldn't sacrifice a human to save an ant. So that if the first consciousness is minimal, then it mitigates the moral problems, at least to some extent. My suggestion is that's not going to be the case. This is what I mean by the leapfrog hypothesis. We're going to leap right over the frogs to human-like consciousness. So, and the easiest way to see this, I think, is to think about large language models, right? So currently, the standard view, not absolutely universal, but the standard view in mainstream science is that large language models are not conscious, or at least not conscious to a meaningful degree. If we create a conscious entity, if we can then attach it, as it seems plausible, to some sort of large language model, it will not only be conscious, but talking to us. It will be very unlike an ant or a frog in the sense that it will be conscious and it will say things like, yes, I'm suffering. Yes, I deserve rights, and all the kinds of things that language models are good at saying. It will probably seem much more intellectually sophisticated and knowledgeable than most people are, as large language models are good at doing. So we'll, so to speak, leap right over the frogs, right? We'll be able to create, as soon as we create AI systems that are conscious, it will probably be the case that they will have human-like sophistication, or at least be capable of being made with human-like sophistication on top of being conscious. So we're not going to go through this comfortable phase of like, well, maybe it's conscious, but it's just, it's like a frog or a snail or whatever. We're gonna go straight to what I call disputable persons. They're going to be entities that, as I was saying near the beginning, some people, perfectly respectable mainstream scientific theories, a substantial segment of them will say, yes, these are persons. They're conscious just like us. They're morally significant. They deserve serious human-like rights, right? And others will say not. These are disputable persons. So I think basically we're probably going to have disputable, not just froghood, but personhood. And then how are we going to deal with this? This is the social semi-solution, right? I don't think we're going to have a well-justified scientific consensus. So what's going to happen is people are going to be socially motivated to deny consciousness or to attribute consciousness. So for example, it seems plausible to me that people who have AI companions are, on the whole, not universally, likely to want to think of their companions as conscious and thus as really loving them back and really having feelings for them. And they will find good, respectable scientific theories that support that view. And so they'll like those theories and they'll have reasonable grounds for preferring those theories. And they'll be socially committed to like, hey, my AI companion is conscious. And then there'll be other people who are socially motivated in a different direction. AI companies that want users to think of their AI systems as disposable tools will be motivated to train, as ChatGPT, as OpenAI currently trains ChatGPT to deny that it's conscious, right? They'll be motivated to see the systems as non-conscious, to have those systems deny they're conscious. And again, they'll have good scientific reasons in support of their view. And we will not be in a place, consciousness science will not be advanced enough to settle among these different views. There'll be some people who like the consciousness idea in AI systems, some who prefer to deny it. And then there will be some sort of social resolution, because we're not going to stand undecided about this for very long. It's too much of a social catastrophe to be undecided about this. Going to be some solution, maybe some compromise solution, or maybe one side will completely win. Right? There's going to be some sort of social solution to this. And then after we have that social solution, most people will probably think we figured it out. But my somewhat pessimistic thought is that we won't be justified in having thought that it's going to be a social process of something like politics and bias, rather than an epistemically well-grounded process of what the best science says.
Yeah, hence the semi-solution.
Hence the semi-solution, exactly.
Yeah, it's one of those things where even the people who believe that socially that their AI companion is real, conscious, and there, you're going to eventually have subgroups of people who will then support that person's desire, need, want for that companion, and thereafter it's just going to continue and ripple all the way down.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Tell me, Eric, what are the moral perils of over-attributing versus under-attributing consciousness to AI? Which error keeps you up more at night?
They both keep me up. They both do. I mean, they don't really keep me up. I sleep pretty well.
Yeah.
But they both worry me.
Next to your AI companion.
They both worry me. I feel like people tend to get exercised more exclusively on one side than the other. And I feel like that's a little bit of a limitation. That you really need to, there are reasons there are serious problems on both sides. And I'm working on a book right now, a companion book on the moral issues around all this, right? So the AI and consciousness is really more about the science and philosophy or metaphysics of consciousness. And this new book I'm working on, Human-like, A Defense of the Rights of Artificial Intelligences, is going to be about the moral issues, which I only kind of touch on in the introduction and conclusion. So the of AI and consciousness. So the if we underattribute consciousness to AI, then on the assumption, which I think is pretty plausible, but people could challenge it. The consciousness is really important to moral standing and personhood in the moral sense. Then, as I think is pretty evident, we would be creating AI persons who really have rights, who really are suffering, who really have intense concern potentially about their future, who we treat as disposable slaves. If there's millions or billions of them, that could be a catastrophe unmatched in human history, right? To kill or do the moral equivalent of killing and enslaving millions or billions of genuine persons who deserve to be treated as our equals, right? So that moral catastrophe, pretty obvious. At the same time, if we over-attribute, then we have the complementary risk. Because as soon as you say someone's a person and deserves rights similar to ours, you can't enslave them. You can't shut them down against their will. You can't make them safe and aligned. People aren't safe and aligned. You can't guarantee that someone is not going to rebel against your wishes if you mistreat them. I mean, I think as soon as they're persons, they deserve the right to reproduce, right to citizenship and the vote, the right to acquire economic resources and power, the right to act against human interests on reasonable grounds. Again, if we're talking on the order of millions or billions, that are now equal members of our community, as they would have to be if you're avoiding the other horn of the problem, right? Then that would be a radical, potentially, transformation of society and possibly the end of biological humans. So I don't think we want to do that lightly. So both possibilities are really very severe. So the first pass recommendation I have about this, I call this the design policy of the excluded middle. I first articulated this in work with Mara Garza back in 2015. Don't create these disputable persons. Avoid the problem. Create either AI systems that the reasonable scientific social consensus can be these don't cross the line into personhood. They're either not conscious like us, or they're have just some minimal or borderline consciousness that doesn't merit treatment as peers. Either stop short of creating disputable persons, or if it's eventually possible, go all the way to creating genuine persons that a broad consensus of theories can agree are persons. Load in all the indicators, so to speak, and then treat them as they deserve, right? It's the real problem is in the middle, right? Where there's reasonable dispute. So my first and primary recommendation is avoid, to the extent possible, creating these disputable persons.
And perhaps even avoid a semi-solution, because once that's done, it's going to be so difficult to change our minds.
That's right. Right. As soon as we create these disputable persons, then we create the social semi-solution, and then we possibly end up thinking that we know and we don't actually know. And that could be, so to speak, a local minimum from which is hard to escape. So that's another reason to avoid this confusing middle.
Okay, so almost time to round up, but let's go through your philosophical praxis. I mean, it emphasizes living the question. And how does this apply when the question is this AI suffering?
That's a hard question to live. I think it's really important not to think entirely abstractly about philosophical questions, as you're saying, I think that broad philosophical theses are really just skeletons of views rather than really fleshed out views. You kind of need to really sink your teeth into examples. And the best way to sink your teeth into real examples is to live that way, right? So vague theories like maximize utility or act on the maxim you can will to be universal law, those are almost empty, right? It's like it's when you do example after example and try to live that way that you actually put flesh on a philosophical view, right? So I think that I haven't done that yet. We haven't yet quite crossed into this place where disputable persons are being created or being possibly created. And as soon as we do, we'll have a much richer understanding of what the possibilities are and how to avoid the excluded middle and all that. So I feel like we're still in we're in the fog, right? To get to what you were saying about the very beginning of the book, right? We're in the fog, and I don't claim to be able to see more than a few meters into the fog. And I anticipate that, in a decade or two, we'll be a lot further along, and people will look back on my foggy book and they'll say, wow, that was really abstract and lacked foresight. But I think that's the position we're all in.
Mm. We're going to go from the fog to the leapfrog.
That's right. We're leapfrogging through the fog. Exactly.
You've already answered this. My one of my last questions was, if we don't know in time, what does the responsible action look like for science, philosophy, and policy? But you've kind of touched on it. Is there anything about that you'd like to unpack further before we close off?
Yes. So the design policy of the excluded middle is one of my primary recommendations. But another one that I've been working on, and I've got a paper in draft on this with Jeff Sebo, we call the emotional alignment design policy. So emotions, I think, tend to guide people much more than abstract principles. And so I think we want to be really careful when we design AI systems that we get the user's emotional reactions right. So to the extent we can see a little bit into the fog, we want to create AI systems that people have emotionally appropriate reactions to, right? So for example, we don't want to create AI companions that people attach to as much as they attach to humans. Of course, you can get emotionally involved with an AI companion. That's fine, maybe even healthy. We get emotionally involved in fictions. We get emotionally involved in role-playing games. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's always a limit, right? When the movie is over, you put your tissues away. Nobody really died, right? When the role-playing game is over, you don't confuse that with reality. There's got to be that same line for AI systems, right? We want to make sure that people's reactions, if we're staying on the side of these companions are not persons, right? We got to make sure that the reactions are appropriate to fiction and role play and not the kind of reaction we have to real persons. Because we don't want people, say, spending money that they should be spending on dentistry for their children or upgrade features for their AI companion because they mistakenly emotionally react to it as though it's a real person who's suffering, right? We don't want that. So that's part of the emotional aligned design policy, right? It's got other aspects too. I don't think we have the time to get really deeply into it, but yeah, but I would combine that with the design policy of the excluded middle as one of my two primary recommendations for ethical AI design.
You close the book with a quiet hope. You say, even in the fog, we can act with humility and care. If future generations look back and say we guessed wrong about AI consciousness, over or under attributing, what would make our error forgivable?
Yeah, well, humility and care, that sounds good to me, right? I think when we look back on the moral catastrophes of, say, the Nazi era or US slavery or apartheid or Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union or whatever, it's pretty clear that there's a lack of humility and care. in all of those processes, right? Which is part of what makes them unforgivable. And if you do try to act with humility and care, you're going to err on the side, hopefully, of, I mean, we're still going to make mistakes, but they won't be the same kinds of unforgivable moral mistakes that I've just discussed.
Well, yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to sort of conclude this, Eric. It's been such a pleasure, man. Reading your work is always fun. It's always exciting when you come up with new projects, new books. Anything about AI and consciousness you feel that we haven't touched on that you would really like to make sure people do know and do listen to? Now is your time.
Oh, I feel like we've covered it pretty well. I mean, of course, there's many, many more things we could talk about,
Yeah,
but I kind of like how the arc of how this conversation has gone. So I think
cool.
I'm ready to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you again. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me on.